I do not need to remind you, but we are in the great controversy. It could be just the fact that I'm getting older. And that certainly plays into it. But there are so many things that now I see and hear and listen to that touch my heart. A young person who is struggling. A mom and dad who are at their wits' end. Children who wonder. The political world. Financial warnings. I do not need to remind you. We are in the great controversy. The battle is raging and we fight not against flesh and blood. And so I've learned over the last, I guess I learned this years ago, but it seems that more recently, I find myself preaching to myself. Okay? So I've just put it out on the table. This sermon is for me. 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Thank you, Mr. Turner, for reading that so well for us. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, beginning in verse 7. The New King James Version. The apostle writes these words, "But we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the excellence of the power may be of God and not of us." The New National Version calls the earthen vessels treasures in jars of clay. You see, in the ancient world, vessels or jars of clay were throwaway containers. At the most, their lifespan was just a few years. They were used to store and transport water, olive oil, grain, and even family treasures. Earthenware jars, they were just part of everyday living. They were used for cooking, eating, drinking, and storing leftovers. Every domestic archaeological excavation always contains remnants of these clay jars. No one took note of the earthen vessels, more than we would take note of a fast food container. They were simply there for convenience. It was no great tragedy when such a vessel was broken. They were cheap and easy to replace. Earthen vessels then provided Paul with this penetrating metaphor for humanity. By the way, Adam was formed out of dust to the ground. And, the Bible tells us clearly, to dust he returned. So in the following verses, the apostle reminds us how the Lord breaks his clay pots, so that the excellence of the power may be of God and not of us. Paul knew the power. He knew the victory of Jesus, because often he was in situations where the only power and victory of Jesus could meet his need. His clay jar was continually crushed by pressing circumstances, yet he was continually sustained by a powerful Christ. Amen. By the way, the story of Gideon gives another insight to clay jars. You remember that? God called that unwilling judge to do a mighty work for him. The army of the enemy was humongous. Over 100,000, and as Gideon, that weakest of the weak, the smallest tribe in Israel, he was in the low on the totem pole in the family of that tribe. Ended up with just how many? 300. 300 to face over 100,000. And what did they have? A trumpet? a torch and a clay pot. And you remember the story when they surrounded the enemy on the hillsides around their encampment. The cry went out for the Lord and for Gideon. Sound your trumpets, break the clay pot. And when that clay jar was broken, the light was admitted. And I believe it paints that same picture for us. It was the breaking of the vessels that made the light shine forth and bring victory to God's people. We too, right, are clay jars. Frail, weak, mortal. And most of the time, these clay vessels of ours have to be broken before they admit the sweet fragrance of God's grace. The Lord does it through the pressures that come in our lives. Verse 7. But we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the excellence of the power may be of God and not of us. Verse 8, we are hard pressed on every side, yet not crushed. We are perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed. In other words, in every way we're troubled, but we aren't crushed by our troubles. We're frustrated, but we don't give up. We're hemmed in, but not hamstrung. Not knowing what to do, but never lacking hope. Hunted by men, but never abandoned by God. Often failed, but never finished. Conflicts will not defeat us. Confusion will not discourage us. Criticisms will not deter us. Cutting down will not destroy us. And I believe there are 4 lessons, 4 phrases from this passage that will encourage us, that will encourage you, that will encourage me. So let's look more closely at these verses. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 8. By the way, for those of you who haven't been to the concordance class, this is what we do in the concordance class. We look at words and we look at what those words mean, and from the meaning of those words, we extrapolate even more meaning for our lives. So, we're going to do a little concordance class, a little word study. And please, I have never defended my dissertation. So I'm not a Greek scholar. I don't even consider myself a scholar. But I like to read, okay? And when you read your concordance, you find these things out. Here it says, what does Paul say in verse 8? We are hard pressed on every side, yet not crushed. The King James Version says we are troubled on every side. And that Greek word, the New Testament was written in Greek, that Greek word literally means to press upon, to crowd close against, to squeeze, to distress, to treat with hostility, to oppress, to harass. You get the picture. Tight quarters, way too close for comfort. Hostility in every direction, north, south, east, west. Everywhere you look, you see and feel nothing but trouble. Home, school, family, friends, New Market, New York, New World, Near East, it doesn't matter. We're hard pressed on every side, yet not crushed. Crushed is a compound word. That means 2 words brought together. Stenos is the first word. It means the narrow. And it's stuck together with kora, which means space or territory. Literally meaning to be restricted or confined to a narrow or tight space, to be pressed for room, to be cooped up, cramped, crushed. Figuratively, that Greek word stenokoreo means to experience circumstances that offer no way of escape. You've been there, haven't you? Feeling crushed with difficulties, burdened by disease, discouragement, distraught, distressed. And Paul says, we are pressed on every side, yet not crushed. There is an allusion to the Greek wrestling games. You know, sometimes in wrestling, I remember taking that in junior high school, Getting slapped around on the mat, PE class. Sometimes in wrestling, you can get held by your opponent so that you can barely move your hand or your foot. And with that in mind, Paul says, we have been pressed in on every side, but we are not crushed. We still have a plan of overcoming. Even if the adversary seems to have us entirely in his power, there is still something we can do to be released. That's what Paul's saying. We may be pressed for room, but in Christ, we still have room. Here it is. Life lesson number 1. I don't have a PowerPoint. I didn't hand you notes. Are you ready? You might want to write it down. You might want to ink it in your memory. Lesson number 1. We may be squeezed, but not squashed. We may be squeezed, but not squashed. Pressure, yes. Trouble, yes. Difficulties, yes. Squeezed, yes. But not squashed. Paul, how can you say that? This world is never easy. Even the simple things, maybe they seem to morph into complicated and difficult. How is that possible? How can you say that we may be squeezed but never squashed? I wonder if Paul would reply this way. I can say that I've been squeezed and not squashed in order that the excellency of the power of God may be Him and not me. The devil squeezed me, but God didn't let him squash me. Life lesson number 1. We may be squeezed, but not squashed. Let's look for number 2. Back to the verse 8. What does it say? We are pressed hard on every side, yet not crushed. And then he says, comma, we are perplexed, but not in despair. Word study. Perplexed means literally to be without a way or a path. You don't know which way to go. You don't know which way to turn. It means to be without resources, to be embarrassed, to be at a loss, to be uncertain, to be dazed and confused, to be in doubt, to be disturbed. Nothing makes sense. There is no rhyme or reason. A logical way out is no way out. We are perplexed, but not in despair. To be perplexed is to be at a loss of how to act, while to be in despair is to be utterly at loss. It is extreme despair. Although Paul may have been at a loss about how to proceed, he never went off the deep end. Paul is saying, we scarcely know what to do, but we have not given way to extreme despair. Hope has not gone from us. An old Latin proverb says this, while I live, I hope. That's good. The Christian rewrite is even better. Even while I die, I still have hope. For the righteous have hope in his death. Life lesson number 2. Before we go there, do you remember number 1? Squeezed, but not squashed. Here's the second one. Bewildered, but not bleak. While you feel as if there's nothing that can be done, you've tried all the options, there's no direction, God is silent, that is bewildering. It's not go, it's not no, it's not even maybe so. Bewildered, but not bleak. We are all together, not without help. When we can do nothing, God can do everything. The death of our strength is the birth of omnipotent might. Squeezed, but not squashed. Bewildered, but not bleak. 1, 2. Let's look for number 3. Verse 9. 4 words. Persecuted, but not forsaken. The word persecuted, dioko. It means to pursue, to prosecute. It means to follow or press hard after, literally to pursue as one does a fleeing enemy, to chase, harass, vex, pressure. Dioko was used to describe chasing down criminals. It speaks of an intense effort of the pursuer to pursue with earnestness and diligence, with the desire of obtaining, not going to stop until I catch you. Dioko paints the picture also of hounds on a hunt aggressively pursuing a fox. Paul is saying, I've been running for my life. I'm always chased from city to city by hostile Jews. They're snapping at my heels. They came after me from Iconium, from Philippi, from Thessalonica, from Berea, from Ephesus. Lord, I get in trouble just because I'm preaching and teaching about you. They're hounding me. They're breathing down my neck. I'm being pursued. And then he says, but I'm not forsaken. Forsaken literally means to leave down in. It conveys the sense of deserting someone in an awful set of circumstances. It's really bad, and your friends leave you. To let someone down, to desert, to leave someone helpless. The meaning of the word is that of forsaking someone in a state of defeat or helplessness in the midst of hostile circumstances. Paul says, we're persecuted, but we're not forsaken. Through it all, Paul never felt abandoned. God did not leave him behind or in the lurch for the enemy to gobble him up. Life lesson number 3. It flows along with squeezed but not squashed, bewildered but not bleak, chased after but not cut off. Paul knew it. And so may we. God doesn't leave us or forsake us. Jesus promised, behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Whatever your age, he says, I will never leave you or forsake you. The devil will chase you, but God will not cut you off. Paul continues in verse 9, we are persecuted but not forsaken, struck down but not destroyed. Struck down. Another one of those compound words, katabalo. I remember that was one of the first verbs I learned in Greek class. Balo. Throw. Ball. B-A-L-L-O. Balo. Throw. Kata. Katabalo means to throw down, cast. It means to strike down as if you're being struck with enough force to knock one to the ground, as when one is hit with a weapon. The word picture is taken from an athlete or a soldier. Wrestling or boxing may have been the background for Paul's use of this word. You see, the Corinthians, they were familiar with the participants in the Olympic Games, the games where people were being pummeled or thrown down to the ground. Katabalo was used to describe either a knockdown in boxing or a throwdown in wrestling. Many a time, the preacher of years ago says, many a time the Christian wrestler is thrown by his foe, but he never has a fatal fall. Struck down, but not destroyed. Destroyed is the Greek word apolumi, which means cause to experience utter destruction or ruin. So you put those two together. It's interesting that both katabalo, the cast down, knocked down, and apolumi are athletic metaphors. One was used to refer to losing a boxing match, as when one is knocked out in boxing. Finished, done, destroyed. I'm sure there were many times when Paul felt katabalo. Whipped, beaten, jailed, pelted by stones, left for dead, shipwrecked. All he was doing was trying to share the good news about Jesus. He wasn't being hurtful to others. He wasn't cheating people out of their money. He was just doing what God was directing him to do. And suddenly, boom, katabalo. Yet he says, we are cast down, but not destroyed. Life lesson number 4. Go through the list with me. Squeezed, but not squashed. Bewildered, but not bleak. Chased after, but not cut off. Knocked down, number 4, knocked down, but not knocked out. Paul was at his wit's end. There was still a way out. He was on the brink of defeat, but he was not defeated. When contrasted with struck down, Paul is saying, was struck down, Paul is saying, I've been hit, but I've not been killed. Violently injured, utterly devastated, or destroyed. You can almost catch the intensity of Paul's paradoxes, the suffering he endured in the earthen vessel of his body. He was squeezed, he was bewildered, he was chased, he was knocked down. What a mess. Not fun. What weakness. But then he contrasts the weakness with God's power. Squeezed, but not squashed. Bewildered, but not bleak. Chased after, but not cut off. Knocked down, but not knocked out. Paul's weakness on one hand and God's power on the other. Again, we have this treasure in the jars of clay to show the surpassing power that it belongs to God and not to us. It wasn't that Paul in each case reached down into his soul and sucked it up and became the man. It was never his strength. It was God's. Paul's weakness was the occasion for God's power. Paul remained an earthen pot, a cracked pot at that, as his crumbling flesh allowed the power of God to shine so brightly. The Steinway piano has been preferred by keyboard masters such as Rachmaninoff, Horowitz, Van Cliburn, Liszt, and for good reason. It is a skillfully crafted instrument that produces phenomenal sound. Steinway pianos, I'm told, are built today the same way they were 164 years ago when Henry Steinway came to the United States from Germany and started his business. 200 craftsmen, 12,000 parts are required to produce one of these magnificent instruments. And most critical is the rim bending process, in which 18 layers of maple are bent around an iron press to create the shape of a Steinway grand piano. 5 coats of lacquer are applied and hand-rubbed to give the piano its outer glow. The instrument then goes to the pounding room, where each key is tested 10,000 times to ensure quality and durability. When we follow Jesus, we're also being handcrafted. We are pressed and formed and shaped to becoming more like Him. We are polished, sometimes to the rubbing of affliction, until we glow. And then the pounding room. 10,000 times on each key. Tested in the laboratory of everyday human experience. Big things, little things, the pounding of family, friendships, finances, physical well-being, emotional stability, constant, all the time, every moment, every day. The process is not pleasant. It's not cheap. It's not convenient. But through God's power, the indwelling presence of the Holy Spirit, you and I can persevere, and your life will increasingly reflect the beauty of Jesus. We are earthen vessels, squeezed but not squashed, bewildered but not bleak, chased after but not cut off, knocked down but not knocked out. Amen. Well, Father, may that song be the prayer of our lives this week. May we have your strength to stand on the solid rock, Jesus Christ. Bless us. We are not worthy, but we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.